Alors, bonjour et bienvenue à Imagination et notre série de conversations avec les cinéastes qui font notre histoire et notre présent de cinéma queer. Aujourd'hui, on va discuter avec Vivian Kleiman sur son film, son documentaire No Straight Lines.
Bienvenue à Imagination. Mon nom est Kat Setzer. I am the Director of Programming, and welcome. We're really pleased to be having this conversation between Christopher DiRaddo and Vivian Kleiman. Chris will be our moderator, so I'd like to say, and this is Phoebe, and I would like to introduce Chris. He is a Montreal-based author. Most recent book, The Family Hour, came out in 2020. He also is the founder and the host of the Violet Hour reading series and book club, and as well produces numerous queer literary events in Montreal. And importantly for us, he is a longtime friend and collaborator of Imagination. We've done some really wonderful things together, and we appreciate him here taking charge of this conversation. So please take it away, Chris.
Say goodbye. So kind of you. Thank you. Thank you, Kat. Thank you, Charlie. It's a pleasure to always be invited to collaborate in Imagination. And I'm so pleased to be joined by Vivian Kleiman. I wish we'd be welcoming you in person in Montreal, but this is the next best thing. So welcome. Thank you so much for the film. I really enjoyed it. I loved it a lot. I think I mentioned to you when Justin Hall's book came out on the same subject. No string. Sorry, the No Straight Lines. The 4 decades. I read it cover to cover. I was always such a big, huge comics fan, and but your film offers, it goes very deep. It offers such a nuanced and important history of queer comics. You speak to some of the legendary comic artists, and then you also speak with the next generation as well. And in some ways, your documentary does for queer representation in comics what the Celluloid Closet did for queer representation in film. Several times I kind of thought about this, this is going to be such an important reference document also, I think, moving forward. Can you tell us just a bit about the genesis of this project? How did it come to be?
Well, first of all, I want to say how grateful I am that we have technology that can afford us this opportunity to have a discussion, even though due to the COVID crisis, I can't join you in person. And also, I need to add your parallel with the Celluloid Closet. My goodness, Vita Russo, the author of that book, was a friend of mine and was one of the most incredible scholars and human beings on the planet. So thank you so much for that introduction. I'm delighted. Ça fait grand plaisir d'assister ici aujourd'hui avec toi.
Merci beaucoup.
The genesis of the film was actually not initiated by me. I was approached by a colleague of mine, Greg Sirota, and his friend, Justin Hall, the editor of that anthology, No Straight Lines, who had an idea of doing a film based on Justin's book. They encouraged me to attend the world's first ingathering of queer comic book artists that took place in New York in 2015. And I was a little hesitant because even though I was enormously impacted by Alison Bechdel's Dykes to Watch Out For in the 80s, as it was serialized in my regional feminist newspaper, Plexus, in California. I nonetheless wasn't really a comics fan per se, but I went because I was curious about the subject, and especially given the success of Alison Bechdel's Fun Home, which won all this accolade as one of, anyway, I'll set that aside. But they encouraged me to attend this first ingathering of queer comic book artists. And I remember that moment when I walked into the conference hall. Standing in the middle of the room was this young person with chartreuse dyed hair, completely tattooed and pierced and just wonderful, very festive for me. And she was completely engaged in conversation with this elder gentleman with balding head and a slight paunch and a button-down Ivy League shirt with stripes, And they were surrounded by a whole array of queer people who were gender non-conforming on, the one extreme to this GQ kind of, not gentleman, cute guy, and very much a guy. And I went, oh my goodness, something special is going on here. What is it that's bringing these people together and creating such a force, a life force, that was so affirming and so joyful? You could just feel it in the air. And by the end of the conference, 2 or 3 day conference, I had heard so many stories. I had attended all these panels. I got introduced to a whole variety, a whole panoply of images and stories that truly impressed me. And I left there thinking, wow, this is a casting director's dream. And the problem was going to be how to narrow down the selection of individuals to film and how to narrow down the story so that the film that I make isn't just a chronology, isn't just an encyclopedia of who did what when, but would actually be what we call a nonfiction film, something that had its own integrity as a work of art, really.
I can't believe 2015 was the first time that there was this conference. It was interesting to me because I was actually struck by how come no one has done this before. No one has done something on this subject, because it's very popular. There is a kind of a very huge and diverse fan base for queer comics. You talk about just now about Dykes to Watch Out For. For myself, I remember being captivated in the 90s too by there was also Curbside, and there were different kind of comics that I would, in Montreal, sometimes we would get these queer publications in from Boston. There was kind of in News Weekly and The Guide, and they would always have these serialized comics in them. And I remember trying to get my hands on them, and some months they wouldn't show up in the stores, so then I wouldn't know what happened in the following months. And then everything shifted online, of course. Then I remember actually kind of going onto the website of these newspapers. And it's interesting because sometimes, queer comics remind me of a simpler time, a slower time, if that makes sense. And your film actually also made me very nostalgic also for that. Can you talk to me about your own nostalgia? Because, you talked a bit about Dykes to Watch Out For. What was it about that comic strip that spoke to you, I guess, personally? I mean, you said you weren't a huge comics fan, but it was something that kind of remained with you. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, first of all, I love that you used the word nostalgia, because that was one of the words that struck me as I was editing the film. When I look back at when we had the first assembly of the film, this 2.5 hour behemoth, and I saw who was included and what stories were included, I felt like it was really going to be an interesting film, but it was going to be a nostalgic romp. And that would serve a purpose for people of a certain age, but it would also be of no interest to people of a younger generation. And it was the younger generation of people who I felt needed to hear these stories. So for me, thinking about Alison Bechdel's work, I have yet to find language that describes the impact of actually seeing my life experience presented on paper, in images, in a newspaper, and capturing my daily life, capturing my big, the big traumas of the day here in the States, the Vietnam War, and what was going on in Central America, and the political stuff, the big political issues of the day, but also, the very particulars of daily life, looking for love, or at least, a hot babe, living, with roommates, coming out stories. It just was it was so impactful that it's impossible to describe the impact of actually seeing one's own life story shared in a vernacular that was accessible. I am struggling to talk about how valuable it is. As Alison Bechdel herself says in the film, it's a revolutionary act to tell our own stories. And I think that's true for, our queer community, but it's also true for others.
Comics, though, it was interesting because like what struck me too while watching this is that comics, I feel like almost more than most mediums, seem very autobiographical to me. When we talk about fiction, like, whether they be like, I just saw Dune, like, these are these things that are fantastical. They're kind of, you go into kind of lose yourself. And sometimes it feels like with books and with sometimes with film, it's escapism. But comics, I feel like in an interesting way, really become this platform to people kind of also express themselves, and I think we saw that also a lot in your film too with the next generation, who are also using comics because that generation themselves don't really see themselves reflected also, which is what the legends were doing, and now it's like it kind of continues. I'm curious to like, do you have any thoughts a bit about like, as a medium, why this combination of text and images seems to be such a powerful tool for self-expression?
I completely love that question, and there's another one where I don't really have a. I feel like it's really complicated. I haven't totally figured it out. There are some scholars that I've spoken with, some queer scholars, who feel that comics themselves are a medium that is queer by definition. I'm not. I wrestle with that notion, and I can't say that I fully embrace it, but I'm tickled by it. For me, I think that because it was so accessible, and especially back then in the beginning when Mary Wing sat down in the early 70s and wanted to draw a corrective to the comics that she had been seeing and give a more accurate representation of what it's like to be a lesbian. I think that impetus to let's correct the stereotypes. So let's tell the true story because we haven't been able to tell our stories. I think the accessibility of comics was really what made it unique for queer people to grab on as a tool to not necessarily turn to and create superheroes, though some of us did do that. Rupert Kennard was creating superheroes that are queer. But by and large, the majority of the impetus was for telling our stories fully in a more realistic kind of a vein. What I find really interesting is how things have kind of morphed over time. I didn't analyze it per se, but it's there in the film if you're following it closely, how what starts off as being very scratchy, rudimentary, image making and storytelling morphed then into something very sophisticated and was accepted in mainstream audiences with with Fun Home being converted into translated or transposed into a Broadway musical. And then we have today a new generation of queers, non-binary, undefined, completely kind of like enjoying the possibilities of self, and completely rejecting, some cubicles of definitions of representation. And so we have webcomics today that are. I had my editor look at the first batch of webcomics that came in our door, and she said to me, "Hey, we can't use these. These don't read as queer images." And I went, "Well, golly, that's exactly it. C'est pour ça qu'on va inclure les images dans le film."
I wonder too if some of this the kind of the personal on the page also comes from the fact that a lot of it's very DIY, right? Like we also have a lot of artists who are kind of working with their hands, right? And I was kind of struck also by, like, for instance, like watching Howard Cruz, create these detail on these really big scale, like in order to kind of get like the pattern on the sweater really well, or even like Alison Bechdel's process of kind of like, writing over the work, and so even though there are kind of advancements in technology, it's still very much very DIY. It seems also kind of nostalgic to me in that way too. Was there anything that surprised you about like maybe the creative process for some of these works?
Yes, very much so. I would say I had no idea of the meticulous attention to detail that a lot of the most accomplished of comic book artists achieved. That their dedication to that level of representation to get if we're talking about 1969 and there's a radio, it has to be that radio of that period. And I feel like it's that sense of dedication to specificity that infused their work with enormous emotional vitality and resonance. And I had, I had a stereotype of the artist, for example. My stereotype of, the comic book artist came from the underground comics scene of Robert Crumb and these snarly, antisocial kind of people. And as I said, the people the queer comics were quite the opposite for the most part. And I think that sense of community, that sense of generosity, that sense of connection also was very surprising to me. As Allison says in the film, there was no expectation of remuneration, of making a living from it per se, and that understanding, that DIY, do it yourself impetus, I think kind of set the tone as well, and they all kind of worked hand in hand. So I think that there's many surprises actually for me in discovering more about the work and the people.
One of the treasures of this film is that you probably captured the most important, if not last, in-depth interview with Howard Cruz. He passed away 2019, I believe,
yeah, 2019.
And I was struck in the film not only by how much he had inspired everyone, but also like how kind he also seemed to everyone, and even like these legends could kind of pick up the phone and ask him for advice. And there was this, sometimes you have this notion of artists working in a similar field and there's a lot of competition, for instance, right? But that never really seemed to be the case. There was genuine love and trust. And, people like Jennifer Camper and Alison Bechtel would turn to him for advice. Like, what was it like to meet him? Can you talk a little bit about what the interview process was like working with Howard?
Howard was indeed a true Southern gentleman. And a very generous and gracious person. His ideas of reaching out and helping others continued from the start of his career to the end. And he was just a very kind and generous and patient and person who had a very fun sense of humor. At one point, I even thought of just profiling him, having his story be the spine of the film, and in the end I made other decisions. But yeah, I would say that it was a joy and a privilege and an honor and a learning. I learned a lot from him in terms of that kindness, I would say.
You also have this really touching scene with Jennifer Camper as she begins to speak about, the AIDS years, but then she can't, and she leaves the interview and you focus on the chair. And I thought it was such a beautiful moment to keep in the film and capture, queer comics really captured the reality of AIDS and our lives and the hardships of our lives in such a profound way. Did you find that it was difficult to have people open up? Were people kind of reticent to kind of share some of their thoughts, or was it difficult for them too, even to kind of access certain memories?
That's an important question. I personally am curious about people. I enjoy, one of my hobbies is talking to strangers and getting to know them, be it in the elevator or on the subway or at a restaurant. And so for me, I'm always asking questions of people, and I'm always getting the feedback that folks feel very comfortable talking with me. So I personally have never had a problem I've never had the experience of people being reluctant to talk with me. I've actually had the opposite. There's a lot of power in interviewing somebody on camera. People often talk about, oh, you can't hide the camera. People are different. People are different when you have a camera. And I have found that it's been more focused and more powerful. People actually end up revealing parts of themselves that they hadn't thought about in quite a long time. And that happened on a few occasions. It happened with Alison Bechtel talking about her experience of writing Fun Home and her experience of coming out to her parents, and then shortly thereafter her father committing suicide, possibly as a result of her coming out as a lesbian. At that moment, now there's somebody who's been interviewed 10 trillion times. I had no expectation of something new and different, but there was something about maybe me being a lesbian interviewing her, and in the context of this professional of story of situating her with Howard, somebody who she admired and who influenced her so much, that she actually started to get teary-eyed at one point. At that moment, I had a choice. I remember very consciously sitting there. I allowed a pause as I saw her eyes getting a little watery. I remember thinking, oh, I could ask a follow-up question and she'll start to cry. Well, but do I need that for this film? What is this? What is the focus of this film? And do I need to bring her to that place where she could possibly get very deeply emotionally impacted? And at that moment, I decided, no, this isn't a film. I'm not, I don't know what you see in Montreal, but like 60 Minutes here at CBS in the States, that's their moment they go for. They go for that, get them to cry. Make them
cutting the onions. Yeah, they're just going to, Yeah.
That's exactly it. Yeah. And I felt like, I would be greedy if I were to do that. I didn't need that for this film. And so I stopped. I allowed for that moment. And it was very, very, I felt very connected with her. I think it was mutual. And that was adequate. I need to, at this moment, give kudos to my crew. You mentioned that moment when Jen Camper was talking about AIDS. And we were talking, it was very interesting for me how she was talking about the queer artists, the different kinds of responses that queer artists had to the AIDS epidemic. And at one point, she became very emotional and got up from the seat and walked out of the room. And because I had Andy Black, a wonderful cinematographer with whom I'd worked on the whole project, we spent extra money to pay for Andy to fly to all the different locations, something that most of my colleagues no longer spend money on. But because he knew the film and he had a sense of the tone, he understood exactly what that moment was. And without anyone saying a word, total silence, he let the camera keep rolling. And the sound recorders, somebody actually hadn't worked with before, but a highly experienced sound recordist, Judy Karp, who had worked with filmmakers like Jonathan Demme and Michael Moore. She just kept recording. And we waited maybe, I don't remember how long, a full minute, 30 seconds, a long amount of time for Jen to return. And it was just, it's one of those kinds of moments that you can't plan for. And you might not even necessarily know it will be used in the film, but it just shows how filmmaking is a collaborative art. And it took all of us, all three of us, and our aesthetic sensibilities to understand that we had to respect that moment and wait and see what happens.
I'm glad you kept it. In a weird way too, it kind of also breaks the wall of like you're actually making a movie, and you actually kind of see the hug. There's like a hug there too. And anyway, I thought it was very touching. I was also touched at the card that Rupert Kennard received from the others, which I thought was really a wonderful thing to include as well. I unfortunately hadn't heard of Rupert Kennard before watching this film, and didn't know his legacy of creating the Brown Bomber, who was the first ongoing gay African-American comic strip character. You interview also in the film a young comics artist who also confesses that he didn't know about Rupert Kennard either until a few years before. Is this part of the reason why you wanted to do the documentary, to kind of provide that link? Because if they're only having these conferences, if you said they started in 2015, I think there probably is a lot that still is I didn't know about Howard Cruz, to be quite honest with you, until a few years ago. I think Alison Bechdel probably everyone knows because of the success of Fun Home. But I think there is a lot more to be learned. Is that something that you were kind of hoping to do with the film?
Well, filmmaking is at least documentary filmmaking that I do is I set out with a certain kind of I have an idea in mind at the beginning. You have to have a focus, but you also have to, or I should say, it behooves you to be open to what emerges and new ideas, and perhaps your original concept might be proven wrong, or certainly, hopefully, would be expanded upon, and a more nuanced understanding would emerge in the process of working on a film. And in this case, first of all, I knew Rupert before his, I should say, I don't know when people are going to see this. I knew Rupert in the 80s. He and I had a mutual friend, actually Marlon Riggs, a very controversial experimental documentary filmmaker, did a piece called Tongues Untied. And Marlon was my film partner. So I knew Rupert from back then. And of course he was going to be in the film because he was a buddy. But I didn't plan on including younger people in the film. I knew I wanted it to reach younger people. And when I had that assembly, the first assembly of the film, and I looked at all the people, I saw that the people who were included were all over the age of 50. I felt like I needed to expand the story somehow. And then began an experiment to figure out what could I do that wouldn't, if I were to give equal valence to all the decades of queer comic book creations, it would be a very boring film, I promise you. So I started to play with ideas and finally landed on just giving little, what I call my Greek chorus, just having like little comments from a variety of younger generation people, next gen folks. Like in German, they say a Vorspeise, a little appetizer. S'amuse la bouche. And by the way, when I showed it to people over the age of 40, they would look at the rough cut and they go, well, why are you showing these people and not explaining, why you have to give me more information about them? Like this 22-year-old, who are they? What's their artwork? I want to know where they were born. And when I showed it to younger people, they go like, why are you asking me that question? What's the problem? It's like, it's obvious that they're there and I don't need to know anything more about them. So it was a very complicated process of discovery, I guess I would have to say, ultimately.
I mean, I felt like it could even be a longer series if you really wanted to do it. There was probably so much you could
get that funding from the CBC.
Like, for instance, like Justin Hall's book, right, did feature other kind of contributors and stuff like that. How was it difficult for you to decide who to include or who you were going to interview? How did you make that decision?
You've landed on the most difficult part. Well, one of the two most difficult parts of the filmmaking process. That was the first challenge, and the second challenge was how to introduce the film, how to create the film introduction. To answer your question, it was very difficult. Normally, in a documentary film of this kind, I would choose 3 people to focus on and no more. 3 people is a good amount. You get to know them, you get to hear the stories, you feel like you have a connection. There was no way that I could narrow it down to 3. I mean, that was just impossible. So I took a risk and I expanded it to 5. Justin Hall kept pushing me because these were people he knew and loved and valued, and their work was valued. And I just had to say, look, I can add more people, but it's just going to water down the narrative arc and that emotional experience that the reason I do what I do as an independent filmmaker is really to create some kind of an emotional experience. In my film, hopefully there's both the poignant and the humorous that are braided together. So finally, I was able to make peace with that challenge of making that selection of 5 individuals, because we do have websites now and we do have this thing called the internet. And if anybody's curious about anything, they push a button and your question gets answered, and you can purchase Justin's book and you'll get introduced to some 70 different queer artists, and hopefully that would encourage a little more research and investigation.
Another great thing about the internet is too, you can turn to it sometimes for funding, which I know that this project did. There was a Kickstarter. I would have loved to have Alison Bechdel's cat Donald as a meow ring. That sounds so amazing to me. I can't believe I didn't see that in the past. And
Thank
then
you for noticing that. That was actually that was the favorite reward that people got.
I want to know what it
Alison
sounds
cat
like.
ringtone.
I want to know what that sounds like. But you could also be a character in an original comic produced by an artist. And I'm curious, like, what was it like to kind of like crowdsource the funding of this film? Was it stressful? Was it, I know that the all models of production for so many things are changing these days. What was the experience like? And did you get a sense of the fandom also, I guess, through offering these types of kind of like objects for people to be able to kind of, I guess, also kind of consume it in a unique way?
Well, first of all, I think anybody who's turned to crowdfunding, no matter what their project, would agree that it's an arduous and painful process to undertake. For us, we initially got funding pretty quickly for the film, initial funding, and to develop it. And then that came to a halt. We were having trouble. So we turned to crowdfunding, not only to increase the money in the coffers, but also it's a great way to spread word about the film. And in fact, the folks at Kickstarter itself were really supportive of the project, and they spotlighted us on their newsletter. We were the project of the day, and then we were project of the week. It's actually documented that we got out of the, I forget, $40,000 campaign that we ran, US dollars. We got $5,000 just because of the Kickstarter attention. I would have to say part of the problem but we did not get the fandom that we all had expected. And I think that part of the problem of getting support for this film is that it's not just any one thing. It's not just a profile of Alison Bechdel. That would have been a piece of cake to fund. And I thought of that at one point. And it's not just Tom of Finland with all the sexual erotica images that would have brought in another audience that would have loved to see it and would have loved the film. I was trying to do a more complicated documentary. I was braiding personal stories with the general political issues of the day, with the notion of the evolution of an art form, and the changes in, as Karl Marx would say, the means of production, coming from starting with a little scratchy sit down on the couch with bad lighting and rapidograph with a sketchbook, to Alison Bechdel's, book appearing as Book of the Year on Time magazine's cover. So I think it was kind of hard to explain what the film was about. Some films are just like that, and so we didn't grab the attention in as much as I would have liked, but we're certainly making up for it now that it's been released.
So you've mentioned Justin Hall a couple of times. I know that he's an executive producer on the documentary. And you, like Justin, I believe, live in the Bay Area, correct? Right?
Yes.
So did you know each other before the project, or was that what, I just get this sense sometimes that the Bay Area is this lovely place for artists that everyone knows each other, and like, in the way that maybe the comic world, everyone was collaboration. It kind of also felt very kind of collaborative here too. What was that experience like?
No, unfortunately, I did not know Justin. We had a mutual friend in Greg Sirota, an editor who I had brought on for a few other projects. But we certainly were simpatico, and we share many similar values in terms of. He hadn't done a documentary before, but we had similar intentions of values of high production value and making it right and doing something that was going to have a long shelf life, not just a little flash in the pan. And we both have a great sense of humor. But the Bay Area, it's actually interesting that you saw that we both were living in, you noticed that we both were from the Bay Area, because the Bay Area itself was one of the hubs for queer comics. And a lot of the art makers either live there or have lived there for various times, or certainly have a connection to the Bay Area. So for many decades, the Bay Area was a unique place, not the only place, but a unique place for nourishing artists And yeah, I hope that now that San Francisco downtown has become a ghost town because of, unfortunately, because of COVID, but one of the unintended consequences could be that it might become affordable again for artists to live and create.
Wouldn't that be nice? I think the opposite is happening here in Montreal. It's actually sent the property values through the roof. But I have to say, I do miss San Francisco a lot, and I cannot wait to come back and visit. You've had quite the career. You've won a Peabody Award and nominated for an Emmy and other awards as well. And you mentioned working with Marlon Riggs. What made you decide that you wanted to become a documentary filmmaker? What was it about this path that was so appealing to you? I mean, I can understand, but I'd like to get it in your own words. Like, what was it about it?
Hey, Chris, I was promised a limo and cocaine and champagne flowing nonstop. Oh, for the rude awakening. In college, I had studied I dual interests in history and art history, and also in studio art. So I had both a sense for the visuals and also a sense of history. And documentary filmmaking is a perfect marriage of those two interests. I couldn't have been happier. I didn't seek it out. Someone approached me for expertise that I had in a subject matter, and he knew filmmaking, and I knew the subject, so we joined forces, and that was my first film project as a producer. I took to it like a fish to water, and I've been addicted to it ever since.
Well, I looked at the film's website, and this film is popular. It's being presented at film festivals all over the world, but it's a pandemic. How has that been for you? I guess you're appearing virtually here. It would have been great to kind of have you in person. Have you been able to travel a little bit with the film, or how has it been to kind of also connect with people in different cities just around the film, but not necessarily being able to be there?
Well, you've nailed it again. I am completely heartbroken. While documentary filmmaking has not afforded me limos and all of that other stuff, it has afforded me the opportunity to travel with films. I love to travel. As I said before, I love meeting new people. And that's normally the payoff as a documentary filmmaker. The payoff is to travel to different cities, different countries, different festivals, and have a chance to meet people and talk to people that otherwise would have no business talking with. I'm heartbroken, to put it mildly. And thanks to technology, we have at least some ability for connection and communication. But hey, as I said earlier, I did the film for a younger audience, but I did not do the film with any expectation of an international distribution. In fact, I thought it was very much an American subject, and I never expected it to necessarily appeal to an international audience. I am stunned and amazed that within the first 2 months of the film being released, which was the premiere at Tribeca, it was translated into Spanish for Barcelona, into Turkish for Ankara, a festival in Ankara. I was invited without reaching out to them. They were invited to the Women's International Film Festival in Seoul, South Korea. I assume they translated into Korean. It's been translated into German. It's about to be translated into Portuguese for Brazil. It's like, how did this happen? Oh, and French. It's going to be in Paris, actually, at the end of the month. I don't understand myself. All I can say is that it reminds me of, I helped Marlon on his landmark work, Tongues Untied. And I also was involved in its re-release in 2019 when I realized that it was 30 years since the film had been released. And we lost poor Marlon in 1994. The lesson I learned from Tongues Untied is that he did that piece for a very specific audience, Black gay men. And at every cut, he would ask the question, is this a comment about Black gay experience for an outsider? Or is this extending the discussion among Black gay men? If it's the former, out it goes. If it's the latter, in it stays. And from that, I took away the lesson that, again, from the very particular emerges this infusion of vitality and passion and emotional resonance that really has crossover appeal. And I think that that's not to make a comparison between my work's power and the incredible power of Tongues Untied, but just to say that I know that my connection with Marlon definitely has informed my experience as a filmmaker and how I view the world, how I experience the world, and my decision making as a filmmaker.
Well, I think that's a really great note to end on. Vivian, it's been such a pleasure to speak with you. This film, as I said, it's wonderful. If you're watching this interview, hopefully you saw it. If not, go see it right away. It's a wonderful film. And what's next for you? Are you working on already your next project? Do you want to speak about it at all?
Yeah, there's a few things. You know, I had gotten a fellowship just before COVID. It was supposed to start in January of this coming year, and I've been looking forward to it. But because of COVID, I think I'm going to change the subject. The other topic just doesn't feel as appropriate for right now. I haven't exactly landed on what the new project will be, but I'll keep you posted. At the same time, I do a lot of executive producing, guiding. I see it as like being a coach to less experienced filmmakers. And I have a few projects, and one of them in particular has to do with a very current subject that I can't speak about. So I guess I'll just leave it at that. Right. Just to say that I am both excited and delighted to be accompanying the film, this film, No Straight Lines, on the festival route. At the same time, anticipating getting involved in some new projects.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Vivian.
Merci.
Merci.